Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining our next lecture event in the series What's Next. My name's Clara and I will be one of the moderators. My pronouns are she, her, and we also have Faisal, who is another moderator, and he can introduce himself.
Hi guys, my name is Faisal Karache and I go by he, him.
Yeah, so thank you for joining us on this session of What's Next. This series aims to provide students with some insight to career steps that various alumni have taken to arrive at where they are today. I would now like to read our land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit River. Today, the digital space and conceptual place that we are meeting in, as well as the meeting place of Toronto, are still home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to work and live on this land. While we recognize that not everyone is sharing the same space during this time, we encourage each of you to take time to think about, learn, and reflect upon where you are and the Indigenous peoples who have lived there, are currently there, and the future generations who will live there. As people living on this land, it is essential for us to reflect the ethos and respect that the Indigenous communities show towards the land and towards each other. We must show support through our actions, not just our words, for those of us who are occupying this land.
Thank you for that. So I'm just gonna go through some housekeeping notes. So as you've noticed, we've sort of chosen not to use the webinar format to, foster a sort of more interactive environment. So we just like to kindly remind you to just remain muted during the presentation, and there will be an opportunity for everyone to sort of engage in a dialogue after. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can just use the chat function and we'll take the incoming questions in sort of a chronological order at a Q&A in the end. So we have the amazing Cheyanne Turions. She's a curator, cultural worker, and writer. Her work positions exhibitions and criticisms as social gestures, where she responds to artistic practices by linking aesthetics and politics through discourse. Recent projects include Affirmations for Wildflowers, an Ethnobotany of Desire, a solo exhibition by Tania Willard, and The Pandemic is a Portal, a group exhibition. She is also the curator at Simon Fraser University Galleries and sits on the board of directors at 221A and the National Editorial Advisory Committee of Canadian Art. She's also a founding member of Emilia Amalia, which is sort of an exploratory working group that employs, practices of citation, annotation, and autobiography, sort of as modes of activating feminist practices. So please, Cheyanne, take it away.
Faisal, thank you, and Claire, thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you for everyone who has come. My name is Cheyanne, and I use she and her pronouns. Today, I am in a gloriously sunny Vancouver, which is the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Skwxwú7mesh and Səl people. As mentioned, I currently work as the curator at SFU Galleries, which is also based on these unceded territories. And I feel like acknowledging that the activities of SFU Galleries, or my activity here today as part of this conversation, is happening on colonized Indigenous territories, is hopefully a recognition. Well, it is a recognition. I want it to be a recognition that settler colonialism is an ongoing structure, but I also want it to be a commitment to support the capacity of art to unsettle these conditions. So when I was invited to be part of the event today, it was, under the auspices of talking about, what happens after graduation. And so I thought that I could share a few stories about how I feel like my work has changed from pre-masters to post-masters, and to reflect on the opportunities and challenges and contexts that the choices I've made have been made within that have enabled these different kinds of work. So before I went to the U of T, I did the Masters of Visual Studies program, and I was focused in the curatorial stream. I had been working as a curator for many years, but primarily as an independent curator. So going into institutions to do a single project and working within their structures and mandates. And I love that kind of work, but also it's kind of, I don't actually think I'm that well suited to it. It's a lot of, it's hard. It's very hard to be an independent curator. And so I was really excited about the idea of perhaps like having an institutional position. And so I thought that going to school could be a way to enable that. You know, I also have like a deep skepticism of academia. I kind of feel like it's a pyramid scheme, but also like, you know, it's an opportunity to learn, and it is a way to, you know, academic credentials circulate with a kind of authority that is useful if you're trying to get an institutional job. So yeah, I went into the MVS with this goal in mind. And yeah, I thought that I could talk about some of the decisions that I made in the program that I feel like have helped me to get institutional jobs afterwards. So, and actually I feel very lucky that after I graduated, I was hired as the artistic director, Trinity Square Video, and then moved to Vancouver to be the director of education and public programs at the Vancouver Art Gallery before I went to Simon Fraser University to be the curator of their galleries. So, I guess it worked, like the idea of like going to school to get a job. Yeah, and I feel very lucky about that. And I guess, you know, most of you here, or the students that are here are already like in school. And so perhaps the first thing that I'm going to say is going to be redundant, but in going into the program, in addition to having this sort of logistical goal of like wanting to do different kinds of work, I felt like it was important that I have like a question that I thought might take a couple of years to solve. You know, I feel like that's one of the amazing opportunities of doing, you know, a master's, or I imagine if one does a PhD, to do a PhD, is that you sort of have this space and time to think deeply about whatever it is that you want to think deeply about. And so for me as a curator, I had two sort of things that I wanted to try and understand with more depth. One was two things that I wanted to understand with more depth that I felt really challenged by on a regular basis. And one of those things was poetry, and the other thing was painting. And so I wanted to use the time at the MVS to try and develop a capacity to speak about things and think about things that were outside of my comfort zone. And, you know, at the end of the program, I can't say that I, you know, understand painting or poetry more than I did going in, but that became a kind of engine for me in thinking about how I wanted to be in school. And yeah, I mean, I would love to hear from some of the students afterwards about like what your questions might be, or if this is something that makes sense to you as students. I mean, I feel like we all come to these kinds of educations in so many different ways. And yeah, it's interesting to think about how we get to these places. So the thing that I think is really different about independent curatorial practice versus institutional curatorial practice, to sort of like use it as a metaphor, is that independent curatorial practice is kind of like wide thinking, and institutional curatorial practice, at least in my experience, has been about deep thinking. So as an independent curator, you go into these institutions, again, like working within their mandates, their strategic priorities. Oftentimes, I think independent curators are brought into institutions to ask questions that challenge the institution, or sort of like outside of what they feel like they can create on their own terms. So you're sort of this like adjunct value. But thinking as an institutional curator, it means that I have these spaces that I work with, and I get to think about them over and over again, like what works within them, what doesn't work. What does it mean to try and poke holes in a mandate? What does it mean to use the work that I'm producing with artists as exhibitions to challenge the systems and structures of the institution itself? I feel like it's allowed me to do a kind of systems level thinking that I hadn't been able to do before. And both of those things are necessary. Like at SFU Galleries right now, we're working with 2 independent curators for projects, and the way that their working processes and their thinking challenges mine is really invaluable. But it's also incredible to take the sort of built up knowledge of working in this space over a prolonged period of time to complicate their thinking in turn. One of the other things that I think that going to school at the U of T offered me is a community of shared concern. So some of the professors that I worked with while I was in school are people that I continue to be in dialogue and think with. And similarly, some of the students that I went through the program with are people that I continue to work with. And I feel like that is probably one of the most valuable things that doing a master's degree gave to me, is building a web of relations to continue conversations outside of the spaces of academia. It's one thing, for Barbara Fisher to have to pay attention to me because I'm her student. And it is an incredible, different kind of thing to be able to call on her when I can't figure something out or I need advice. And the building of those relationships, and specifically within the context of a city, allows you to, or it allowed me, to develop this connective tissue that I feel still very much supports my practice, or something that I draw on continually as I go forward. When we were in the waiting room before this, I was talking to Faisal about what it's like to be in the MVS program, because the MVS program has the curatorial stream, it has the artistic stream, but it's also within the architecture department, or I guess now it's architecture, landscape, and forestry and design. It has a lot of stuff in the department.
Yeah, forestry is a separate thing, but yeah.
Okay, so there's all of these different practices that are happening alongside of each other. And for if there's people in the room today that are in the MVS program, one thing that I would really encourage you to do is to, if you are a curator, to think with the artists, in the sense that take it upon yourself to do studio visits with them. Take it upon yourself to learn from how artists think. That will be, if you are pursuing work as a curator, I feel like it's one of the most valuable things that you can take away from that proximity. As a curator, you're always thinking with artists, and frankly, curatorial practice is probably parasitic on artistic practice. Maybe it can be mutually beneficial, whatever, but you need the artist there to do that. But artistic thinking is not like curatorial thinking, and I feel like the research that happens in artistic practice is not the same kind of research that happens in the sciences or, elsewhere in the humanities. And I feel like the important thing about the difference of artistic thinking is that it doesn't have to obey the logic of the way that the world is currently. If you're a political scientist, or if you're in the health, you have to your research is based in what is. But as an artist, your thinking can, put forward these propositions for being in relation otherwise. And I feel like that speculative move of artistic thinking is so incredible. And if you are in this program, to put yourself as closely as possible to what it's like for your peers to be doing that thinking and to try and learn from it. It makes things complicated in a way that I think is so valuable, especially in the world that we have today, where difference is so often like, I don't know, weaponized or something. It's good to be in relationship to that difference, both like, you know, across kinds of thinking, but also in the sense of like moving from what is present to what might be. One of the things that I did while I was in school that I feel like has actually enabled so much of, enabled so much of what I've done afterwards is I made this decision that all of the writing that I would do in school, I would try and get it published. And so I wasn't, you know, trying just to like fulfill the mandates of the, you know, course description or whatever course requirements that might have been presented to me. I was always thinking of like, how do I take this work and let it live in the world? And so I published a bunch of the stuff that I wrote in school as I went through my degree. And that it feels like really one of the most like vibrant like periods of like writing and thinking that I've had in my life. And I would like strongly encourage any of the students that are in the program to think about like where else and how else the thinking that you're doing within academia can live. I feel like it also is a way to, you know, be in a meaningful dialogue with the like constantly changing and unfolding urgencies of the world. And it's really like, you know, you're doing all of this work anyway, why not let it sort of like contribute to who you are outside of those spaces? I mean, I never intended to be an academic. And so that probably motivated my decision to work in this way also. But I feel really thankful that I did make those decisions because that writing and that thinking, yeah, it was just a very fruitful, amazing period of time. And I think that there's many ways that like that can live. When I was in school too, I also had this rule that I wouldn't take a class if it had less than 50% women on the syllabus. And I think about this as a practice of making a bigger hole than the one that you came in through, you know? So I actually like did have conversations with teachers that I wanted to take their class, but their like syllabus was patriarchy heavy, let's say, you know, and saying to them like, you know, I need something different from this. And like some professors, you know, were up for that. Other professors were not, but I feel like, I guess actually this relates back to my work with Emilia Amalia and thinking about, you know, citation and annotation as political practices. You know, when I was in school also, I had rules about who I would cite on the papers that I was writing, with the idea that like citation is a kind of validation of other people's thinking, and that power can be wielded precisely. You know, you can choose to like bring up other thinkers with you in the work that you're doing. You don't have to always just draw from like the same set of perhaps widely recognized sources, although whatever, you know, just citing women doesn't necessarily get you outside of that. But yeah, both of those things, like having a very deliberate practice of citation and having a very deliberate orientation to which classes I would and wouldn't take, I hope in, you know, extremely modest ways, like helped sort of like, yeah, shape a space behind me that was, yeah, just a little bit bigger than the space that I passed through to get into the institution. And I would say that, again, you know, for those of you that are students, you're already students, but maybe if there's some people here that are wondering whether or not they do want to pursue an education, you know, if you're able to get access to the resources that requires, I definitely feel like I'm better off now than I was before. Like I had a lot of skepticism going in to academia, you know, like I had a really hard time actually getting my BA. It took me 10 years to finish my BA. Yeah, and it was really hard and I struggled a lot. And I was like, why am I going to go back into school? Like, but man, it was way easier the second time around. And yeah, just to say that, yeah, I'm better now than I was before. And it is such a privilege to get to think with people over long periods of time like that. And I'm very grateful to have had that experience. So maybe those are like my initial thoughts about like the space between where I was before I started and where I am now.
Thank you so much for that, Cheyanne. We would now like to open it up to everyone if you guys have any questions. We also have some questions for you, Cheyanne. So in case anybody doesn't have any questions yet, we can definitely ask you some. And if you would like to ask a question, you can turn on your mic or your video, or you can also use the chat, and we'll ask Cheyanne your question. Yeah, you can just let us know. So I have one initial question that we can start off with. What was the best or easiest way for you to like make connections with different people in your industry?
Yeah, definitely. I think studio visits. I mean, I think about studio visits as being the basic unit of research for a curator. And so, you know, now even, you know, I'm working at SFU Galleries, like people reach out to me requesting studio visits. I always say yes, you know, and I try to, sometimes it's hard with like, I don't know, bureaucracy, regular stuff of being an institution. It has a way of like feeling really all encompassing, but I think that it's vital to like carve out a space to like, for research, and for that research, you know, being a curator has to be in dialogue with artists. Yeah. So I think at one point I thought that I could only ask an artist for a studio visit if I had an exhibition that I immediately wanted to invite them to. And I've really sort of like, I don't know, loosened up on my nervousness around that. And I'm much more comfortable with engaging in conversation for conversation's sake. And the thing about that is that, yeah, again, it like weaves a kind of connective tissue, you know, like a conversation that I had a year and a half ago suddenly seems like totally relevant to the research that I'm doing for the next exhibition. And you're able to like draw those things into a place where you can revisit them and rework with them. And also, you know, like going to see exhibitions, you know, and I think that it's really great to go see exhibitions when it's not an opening, although this feels like a crazy thing to say this moment in time, because like I don't really remember being with people. But you know, if you go to an exhibition when it's not an opening, chances are that the curator's like in their office working, you know, and like chances are that they'll come out and chat with you if you want to, and that kind of putting yourself in proximity and in dialogue with other people's ways of thinking about how to organize space, how to organize ideas. And then, yeah, like going to events or going to talks and like showing up and like being invested in other people's thinking is a way to, at the very least, like offer them a path back to your thinking. You know, if you're aware of like conversations that are happening elsewhere and you want to like take up somebody's you know, queries, you can build that relationship from yourself to them if you have that understanding of what they're doing. And so I guess like, yeah, it's all just like a general kind of argument for connective tissue. I know I keep saying that phrase over and over again, but it feels really important to me.
Thank you so much.
My name is Jana. I'm a first year MVS student in the curatorial program right now with some of our colleagues are here this evening, and we started our degree during COVID, so it's been super interesting. But I wanted to ask you, and I don't know if this is the case when you were also in the program, but we have these opportunities to take electives outside of the MVS sort of required courses within visual studies. And so we're sort of taking them in, we're all taking in electives in so many different programs in the humanities or information sciences. And I wanted to ask you sort of what electives you gravitated towards, and also if there was any sort of body of knowledge that you wanted to access or something that just really challenged the way that you understood artistic practice and how you navigated that in terms of like integrating these other bodies of knowledge or practices critically into your own curatorial practice?
Well, maybe this actually links back to my BA. So I have a bachelor's in philosophy, and specifically in philosophy of science. And so when I started going to school, I know that I'm bad at math, but I do really love science. So philosophy of science seemed like a way to engage with science without having to like do the work of it. And what, I'm not sure if it's philosophy of science or philosophy in general, but what that gave me was this very clear idea of like how to put forward an argument and sort of like test it out. And so I feel like that has deeply informed how I approach curating. I think about exhibitions as a kind of hypothesis, and you gather together these artistic practices that challenge that hypothesis. And then as the exhibition lives in the world, you get to figure out like whether or not the thinking that you've brought to this hypothesis like resonates with other people, makes sense, or if it's crap and you need to start over. And I really love public programming. And I think that I love public programming so much because it is sort of like where the rubber hits the road in that sense of like where you really get to like be with the public and try and figure out like, you know, what do these artworks mean when they're in relationship to one another? What do they mean under the umbrella of this institution and this idea? Yeah, and to me, that really feels like the scientific process. So I don't know if that like answers the second part of your question, but on my best days, I would like to think that that's the frame that I'm operating in. And then at the U of T for my electives, I can't remember, I think all of them were in like comparative literature. And I took a couple of, well, at least one writing intensive class with Evelyn Gadjo. I can't remember how to pronounce her name out loud, because I did have this idea of like, you know, wanting to produce writing and wanting it to live in the world. And so that was a way to sort of like facilitate this goal. But I don't know, for whatever reason, they were all in comparative literature. And I think maybe that also goes back to what I was saying, like I had these questions going in, which is like, what the fuck do you do with poetry? I don't know. And so that was a way of trying to get at some of that.
I know this is for students to ask Shan, but there is something really important about your past and having met you before you considered going back to graduate school in your role as curator. And one of the things, and it's interesting, you've just mentioned the comparative literature, and of course, as I know your background in the philosophy of science, but was the manner in which you set up a couple of, well, were they about readings? Were they about poetry? Were they, I remember one there were a couple in galleries, but I remember one very fondly around a fire in Dufferin Grove Park. And it may go back, we both share Alberta roots, and you know, whether your stories of slave life may have something to do with that. But there was a beauty to the way in which you approached literature and the textual as a curator, not as a literary critic. And I think that expansion of artistic practice, I would suggest, is key to your success as a curator and of stepping outside the norm of, in quotes, visual studies. And I think expanding upon that would be very useful to the students.
Yeah. Thank you, David, for remembering that. Yeah, that was a beautiful day. And actually, I co-organized that with Gabby Moser. I think, yes. So that was part of a project called No Reading After the Internet, which I ran for many years, which was about a triangulation of knowledge. So usually those events would happen within the space of a gallery, and I would ask an artist to select a text that had either influenced the particular work on display or influenced their practice in general. And the idea is that people would show up and we would read that text out loud together. So the reading out loud from Grove Park, the reading out loud is both meant to like lower a barrier to access, like you don't have to pre-read, you can just show up, but also it was a way of trying to deprioritize expertise and prioritizing improvisation. I don't know like how many people here have ever gone to reading groups before, but I remember like this project was spurred initially from going to a reading group in Vancouver that was reading Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus, which I don't know if anybody here has read that before, but I like sat down to read it and I was like, oh my God, what? Like, I do not know what to do with this. And so I saw that there was a reading group and I was like, okay, great. I'm going to go, we're going to figure it out. And then I went and it was just like a bunch of like dudes showing off how much they knew about Deleuze and Guattari. And I was like, this is not helping me understand actually. So anyway, I wanted to like figure out what is a model where we could do a different kind of thinking together, like less like showing off and bravado and more like, fuck, I don't know what that means. What does it mean? Does anybody else know what it means? And anyway, so the idea of doing these events within the context of a gallery is that, sometimes people show up because they love the author. Sometimes people show up because they love the artist. You have these different, it has a way of like getting different kind of knowledges into the room. And then you get to test out the ideas of the text through the artworks that are on display and test out the proposition of the artworks through the ideas in the text. And like, because the artist who suggested the text write it, they're not necessarily an expert on it either. And so it really, the thing that I love so much about the No Reading After the Internet project is this co-development of an understanding. You build something together, not necessarily through what you know, but maybe through what you don't know. And like, it's really useful, I think, to be in relationship to where your understanding stops. And improvisation was a way for me to, be in kind of be embodied in relationship to that unknowing.
Maybe just as a quick follow-up there, and unfortunately it was mostly old white men, and I'm thinking of the Fluxus poets, but who began to open that up, and the renewed interest in that level of well, it's more than performance art, because it clearly is many things you referred to, but then let's as appropriately remain within the female gender and look to someone such as Anne Carson, who the layout of her texts is spatially as beautiful as her words. I'm thinking of Knox or her translation of the If Not Winter, the fragments of Sappho, where she leaves the appropriate blank on the page where all the other scholars feel compelled to fill in what is missing.
Anne Carson is a genius.
Yes.
Just to say, and also she interestingly, her PhD comes from the U of T in the comparative literature department.
With Derek de Kerkhove. Yeah, Derek de Kerk, who was head of the McLuhan Institute for years, was her advisor.
Well, the lore that I've heard is that she wrote her PhD thesis was Eros the Bittersweet. So we're really getting into like an Anne Carson wormhole right now.
Yeah.
But she almost like wasn't passed or like almost failed with this incredible text because the department was like, what do you do with it or something. This is the lore that I've heard. Don't quote me on it. But I like to think about that as a kind of inspiration.
I think there's truth to the department, but not to her advisor, who remains to this day one of her strongest supporters. But yeah, no, you're quite right. And yeah, she's wonderful. I'm sorry, I've been tangential.
No, just to say that like there's many different kinds of knowledges, and the university often doesn't know how to recognize the breadth of knowledges that do exist.
I have a question. So I feel like with like you talking about, for example, this idea of citation, and, you know, this sort of mode of thinking in terms of the way that educational institutions operate and the way that we, for example, like you were saying, we sort of reference these sort of major thinkers instead of collectively thinking and pulling in the opinions of so many other people. Do you think that there is sort of a mirroring in terms of like educational institutions and also like art institutions? So like what I'm saying is kind of like, is there like a common issue in terms of like the methodology of both institutions? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I totally understand, but like definitely there are modes of thinking and working that are accepted as standard in art, you know, and I think that it is super valuable to query why that is and how else things can be done. You know, at SFU Galleries, we talk a lot about this idea of instituting otherwise, which draws explicitly from the thinking of Ashon Crawley. But it's like we try not to make the assumption that the way that we do things or the way that we have done things has to be the way that we do things. It's a kind of philosophical commitment to being willing to reconsider what our habits are. And, you know, at this moment in time, you know, that being the past year of like living through a plague, you know, it has really tested that, I think, for everyone, you know, in the world, you know, including in the work that I do. And I really feel hopeful that one of the things that will remain after this pandemic moment is a commitment to understanding that, yeah, we can do things differently. And that, in fact, maybe things should be done differently. You know, like there was all of this talk around the beginning of the pandemic, or even now, there's these ideas that, you know, I was just reading something in the New York Times today that it's like, by the fall, things will return to normal. And I'm like, yo, I don't know if that's what the goal should be. I think the thing should be returned to different, ideally more just. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I think that, you know, if we observe in ourselves these habits, the recognition of that habit ideally would be a moment to pause and complicate our commitment to habit.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of, yeah, you kind of did answer my question. It's sort of like we've been so conditioned, maybe that's my sort of opinion or my experience. We've been sort of conditioned to believe that that's the way that it is, and meaning like that's sort of reality when it really isn't. It's very much constructed. So like I do feel weary knowing that this educational institution leads to other institutions, kind of like I'm going to enter other institutions that sort of work off that educational institution as that, like that basis. So yeah, it's basically just challenging certain things that we were taught to believe as like normal, but like things should change. But it's more so thinking about what we should change, because you can't really see what it is. You know what I mean? Like if you've been conditioned all your life, how do you know what's real and what's not? Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the things that I feel really happy about having changed at SFU Galleries is that we've used this pandemic moment to begin building infrastructures of access. So, you know, at the beginning of this, we really, I wasn't thinking about accessibility at SFU Galleries. And this pandemic moment has really offered many opportunities to not just think about it, but to begin developing, infrastructures that will remain post-pandemic. So, you know, at the beginning, when I was being introduced, you mentioned the pandemic is a portal exhibition. And so this was an exhibition where for the first time, we worked with this really brilliant describer to produce image descriptions for all of the images that were part of that exhibition. That exhibition happened on Instagram, so everything had a visual component. And we worked with her to, produce image descriptions for that. You know, we worked with her to produce described videos. So that is what happens when the describer will work with the the original soundscape of a video piece to, in the sort of silences or spaces, insert dialogue that will make it meaningful to people who live with vision loss. So sort of like describing the important like visual elements that are happening there. Anyway, so, and we also started producing described tours. So this is a project where we work with a local person who has training in description to essentially produce like podcasts that describe the exhibitions in a way that are meant to be meaningful, again, for people who live with vision loss. And those, you know, remain on our gallery for anybody to access. And the thing that, I mean, I've noticed so profoundly about these accessibility gestures is that they just like make the exhibition so much better for everyone, whether or not they identify as living with vision loss or not. You know, like saying what you see is incredibly difficult, and like listening to somebody say what they see really is like, for me at least, has been like this mind-bending work of like challenging how I make meaning from looking. And so, yeah, you know, I am committed to not going backwards as far as these accessibility gestures go, you know, like producing described tours for every exhibition now. Yeah, producing image descriptions for all of the images that we put on our website from now on.
That's great.
Maybe that was a tangent, sorry about that.
No, not at all. I feel like it's very relevant. It's like these kind of things that you don't necessarily think about, but we should be thinking about these things, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I have another question. Could you speak to ways in which art can contribute to decolonization in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, a decolonial future or a decolonial present is not the present that we live in. And so we can use the sort of capacity for art to imagine other ways of being in relation as moving towards that. You know, of course, like you're asking me this question from the U of T, and so I have to reiterate, you know, what I think has been one of the most like important papers that have been written in many years, the Tuck and Yang essay, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And they suggest that, you know, decolonization is not about this sort of like social work of like our relationships to one another. It's about giving land back. So in that sense, I don't know if art can contribute to decolonization, although interestingly, at this specific moment in time, at O'Dane Gallery, which is one of the locations of SFU Galleries, we have a project by an artist collective called New Red Order, and that project is called Give It Back. And what the project is so SFU right now, you can't come into any of our buildings. So over the course of the last year, we've been using this like, we have this big bank of windows at the O'Dane that faces Hastings Street. And so we've been making exhibitions that are visible from the street only. And so what New Red Order has done is like turned this giant bank of windows into a kind of real estate office. It has all of this real estate signage, and the signage tells different stories of where settler folks or institutions have literally given land back to Indigenous nations. And what they're selling in this real estate office is this idea that like, that settlers can have like a good feeling about being here if they give the land that they have back to Indigenous people. It's sort of like this, this conceptual project to like encourage people to like move into a space of like understanding the real stakes of decolonization in a way that like isn't just anchored in loss. I feel like a lot of like conversations around giving land back have these like these ungenerous ideas built into them, like what we're all just going to like go back to Europe or something like that. And it's like, well, I don't know, maybe, but like let's talk about it, you know. And I feel like this New Red Order project is a way of moving into that space of talking about it, that is that like they're calling you into that space, they're welcoming you into that space with this promise of feeling better about yourself through doing decolonial work. And so that project perhaps can speak to the literal meaning of decolonization.
Thank you so much for that. That sounded like such an interesting project. So we have about 12 minutes left in the discussion. So if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or ask them in the chat. And yeah.
All right, I'm not going to, you know, the students should be asking because Cheyanne has so much to offer. Maybe just to provoke a little debate, and you spoke of giving the land back. I think it maybe a more appropriate phrase is releasing any claim upon the land, because the land is not to be owned. The land is to be taken care of. It's an aspect of custodianship. And one might argue, and you know, it's one of the problems of being an old white guy, albeit fourth generation Canadian, whatever that means, but it's never been about ownership. It's been about responsibility and respect. And in fact, can indigeneity be an attitude rather than a necessity of claim? And that's with complete respect for that which has been, in quotes, taken away. But it's not about giving it back to, in quotes, another form of ownership. I think there's an extraordinary opportunity here for a much better future.
Well,
or am I just being naive and optimistic?
Well, I don't think that indigeneity can be an attitude, but I do think that responsibility to the land and to each other can be an attitude that we adopt. And so maybe there's something to take there. I mean, the project of Give It Back, like intellectually, I can understand this idea that, like, you know, the land is its own thing, you know, like the idea of ownership, like, does have a kind of absurdity to it, except for the fact that that's totally real, you know, like, and within like this like capitalist, colonialist structure that we live in, I think that it is, with all due respect, like dangerous to not like grapple with the conditions of the way things are currently. I think that there's a way to like get to a different orientation of like what our responsibilities are, but it has to pass through the kind of dispossession that has contextualized the last couple hundred years of life here in Canada. Yeah. And I mean, also like the project of Give It Back, you know, like, so SFU Galleries, the Odin Galleries in the downtown east side in Vancouver, and it's part of a building called the Goldcorp Center for the Arts. And the Goldcorp Center for the Arts is named after a mining company that is well known for human rights abuses around the world. So being able to like put in giant text on those windows, Give It Back, is a way of speaking to SFU, to Goldcorp, to the city of Vancouver, to say like, this is not just like a feel good, it's not just a feel good project about the stories that are represented in the realtor signage. It is also a declaration to the institution to grapple with the role that it plays in this continuing dispossession.
Thank you, and that's what I was pushing towards. As I say, it was by virtue of total support, but a little bit of provocation. So thank you.
There's really great documentation of that project on the SFU Galleries website that all of you should go check out because it's amazing.
But of course, some of the galleries in Vancouver you can visit right now. I think the Vancouver Art Gallery is still, in quotes, open, whereas nothing is open in Toronto. It's very odd.
That's what I hear. That's what I hear.
And then again, SFU has a long tradition of only sound and no visuals. I'm thinking of people like Barry Truax and that whole tradition, how it plays into things that may come out of the gallery.
Well, definitely SFU, well, currently they have the School for Contemporary Arts, and the program there is interdisciplinary. So there's visual artists, there's media artists, there's dancers, there's musicians. And the proposition is that all of these disciplines think alongside of one another. The galleries are, not to get into like the weeds or whatever, but SFU Galleries is part of external relations. We're not part of the academic program. So that's a little bit at a remove. I can't speak with expertise about it, except to say that, yeah, all of these different thinkings are happening alongside of one another. And it is a privilege to get to activate these different kinds of knowledges through the students that, you know, one day again may pass through the gallery space.
Maybe I can ask the last question. Maybe just like some advice for just us students in terms of finding a job in the field, and especially with like the pandemic happening right now. What sort of advice would you offer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my one good piece of advice is like instrumentalize the work that you're doing to exist outside of school. Yeah. And, you know, like find a place that you want to work with or think alongside and like start building a bridge. And also be curious. I don't know, curiosity is really important. But Mitch, did you have a question? I saw a little comment here.
Yeah, I did. So nice to see you. I love that idea of taking the time during this moment to like institute new kinds of sensitivities and take on responsibility for being more inclusive with different communities. And I'm super curious to know how you approached shifting, like, as you know, funding is limited, space is limited, but I love the idea of borrowing from a past structure that might have been kind of oppressive and then turning that into something permanently more inviting to other people. So like whether it's about shifting budget or shifting how you approach the space, like it feels like it's got to be a zero sum kind of thing. So I'm just wondering like where you even started with that to say, no, everybody's experience of these exhibitions is enhanced if we have these descriptions. Mm-hmm. And now that we have them, they're never going away because it's good for everyone. So yeah, I guess, can you just talk about whether or not that's a zero sum sort of thing and how you even kind of wanted to go there, or like how you got to there? I just think it's such a great idea.
Well, I mean, the beginnings were quite humble. For the Pandemic is a Portal exhibition, one of the artists that we work with identifies as a non-visual learner. And I was like, okay, so you're a non-visual learner. I'm asking you to be part of this exhibition. I would like to make it meaningful for you. And so what can I do? And it literally started with his response to that question. And I'm just like, you know, once you like bring in the infrastructure of access, and like, I'm not going to let it go. And so I feel like the second part of the answer to that question is maybe that like budgets are moral documents, you know, and like, yeah, perhaps I don't have as much money for materials, but I do have a budget for image description. And that's something that the artists and I are going to have to work with. You know, I don't know. Yeah. And all, like, I can say thus far, you know, in a couple of like seasons into this, like all of the artists that I have worked with to produce described videos, to produce these described tours, to produce the image descriptions, like they're all thrilled, you know. And I think that if people understand that these things hang in relationship to one another, there's a kind of like goodwill. And so perhaps that like the zero sumness is enabled by the wanting to go there together.
Well, I love that image of making a hole slightly bigger than the one you entered through. And I really appreciate that I don't want to call it a gesture, like that action, because it sets the bar. And that means that the next person who experiences those exhibitions realizes that, yeah, no, like being attentive to different kinds of sensory experience and abilities is like a fundamental thing that should be just the status quo. So thank you for pushing towards that.
Maybe just to say one last thing in that regard, which is that like thinking about like, oh, how do we make the galleries accessible? Like that feels so daunting to me, but having one person to ask that question to made it feel possible. And so like, maybe that could be like my final offering, you know, that like building things begins with like a single sort of building element, and like, yeah, that like, it's possible. It's possible. You know, it doesn't just have to be terrifying, or like, even, I mean, I felt like at the beginning, like a kind of shame that I, you know, hadn't spent, you know, the year previous at the institution, like developing these kinds of things, but also you just got to like get over it and start the work.
Thank you so much, Cheyanne. This was such a fruitful discussion, and I wanted to thank also everyone for coming out, also Faisal for being my lovely co-host, and also Galdu for putting on a great series. So yeah, I think we can just keep our eyes out for the next event in the What's Next series, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. See you later.
So much.
Bye.